Welcome back to the Daily News Roundup, everybody. We've got a pretty full plate today, so we're going to jump right in.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, first up, we've got a huge development in the Ukraine war. The U.S. just announced they're putting a stop to their military and intelligence sharing with Ukraine.
Right, and that's really thrown Europe into a bit of a tizzy. I mean, they're not sure what to make of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big change from what you're used to.
Definitely. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz is calling it, taking a step back. But European leaders are really worried that the U.S. might be pulling out their support entirely.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be nervous about that.
Absolutely. Especially leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron. He's already pushing Europe to spend more on their own defense and get ready for a future where they can't count on the U.S.
So basically, Europe needs to step up and take care of itself.
Yeah, that's pretty much what Macron's saying. He even hinted that France might have to expand its nuclear protection to cover other European countries.
Wow, that would be a huge shift for Europe's defense.
You're telling me. And the EU is now scrambling to hold an emergency summit to figure out what to do. They'll probably be talking about increasing their defense budgets and maybe even expanding that nuclear protection thing Macron was talking about.
So basically, a total overhaul of Europe's defense strategy.
Pretty much. And all of this is happening while there's still a lot of disagreement within the EU itself. You've got leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban who don't even want to talk about Ukraine at the summit.
Sounds like a real mess over there.
You could say that again. It's a really delicate situation.
All right, well, let's switch gears and talk about the Sahel region in Africa. It's becoming a real hotbed for terrorism. Actually, it's now considered the epicenter of global terrorism.
Yeah, more than half of all terrorism-related deaths are happening there now. It's a really complex situation.
So what's driving all this terrorism in the Sahel?
Well, there are a lot of factors at play. You've got extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda operating there, and then you've got political instability, weak governments, and a lot of poverty.
So all of that creates an environment where these groups can really thrive.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you've got Western influence in the region declining, so countries are turning to China and Russia for help with fighting terrorism.
So we're seeing a shift in alliances in the region.
You got it. It's a pretty big change, and it could have some serious implications for global security.
Okay, so from terrorism in the Sahel, let's move on to the situation in Gaza. Things are going from bad to worse there. Israel's now blocking humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. They say it's because Hamas is stealing the supplies.
Right, and of course Hamas is denying that and calling it cheap blackmail on Israel's part. But in the meantime, ordinary Gazans are paying the price. Food prices are skyrocketing.
It sounds pretty desperate. I heard reports that prices for basic goods have doubled practically overnight.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation. And international organizations are starting to speak out about it too. They're worried that Israel might be violating international law with this blockade.
I can see why they'd be concerned. But now on top of all that, the U.S. is getting involved. They're actually starting direct talks with Hamas to try and get their hostages back.
That's a pretty big deal because the U.S. has always refused to negotiate with terrorist organizations before.
So this is a major shift in U.S. policy.
Definitely. It's a risky move, though. It could backfire and make it even harder for Israel to get their own hostages back.
And President Trump isn't making things any easier. He just issued another last warning to Hamas, demanding they release all the hostages immediately.
Right, so he's really turning up the heat on them. But like you said, it's a very delicate situation. Adding more pressure could make things even worse.
Yeah, it's a tough call. Okay, let's turn our attention to the trade war between the U.S. and China. It seems like it's just escalating more and more.
Yeah, after that last round of tariffs that the Trump administration put on China, China basically said they're ready for any kind of war with the U.S.
Wow, that's some serious talk.
It is, and it shows how much mistrust has built up between the two countries. China's accusing the U.S. of trying to bully and intimidate them.
So this is more than just about trade now.
Oh, yeah. It's become a real power struggle between the two biggest economies in the world. And all these tariffs are going to have huge consequences, not just for the U.S. and China, but for the entire global economy.
Yeah, I mean, China's like the world's factory, right? A lot of stuff is made there.
Exactly. So these tariffs are going to disrupt global supply chains and manufacturing. It's going to be a real mess.
And China's not just talking. They're putting their money where their mouth is. They just announced they're increasing their defense budget by over 7%.
Yeah, that sends a pretty clear message. They're not backing down from this fight. And they're especially focused on building up their navy and missile capabilities. It's pretty clear that they want to challenge U.S. dominance in the region.
So this trade war could end up having a really big impact on the balance of power in the world.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay, well, let's take a break from all this heavy stuff and get an update on Pope Francis. The Vatican just said that he's doing better after that respiratory failure he had.
Oh, that's good to hear. I know a lot of people were really worried about him.
Yeah, he's a popular guy. But he's still recovering from that pneumonia, so he had to cancel his Wednesday audience again. That's the third week in a row now.
Oh, wow. Well, hopefully he'll be back to his old self soon. He's a tough guy, though. I'm sure he'll pull through.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Okay, so in some kind of surprising news, Syria's new government is saying they're going to get rid of all the chemical weapons that are left over from the Assad regime.
Now, that's interesting, especially considering all the accusations that Assad was using chemical weapons during the civil war.
So this is a big deal.
It could be. They're asking for help from the international community to get rid of the weapons, though, which could be a good sign. Maybe they're really serious about making a fresh start.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. But at least it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree. It gives a little bit of hope for the future of Syria, which is definitely needed after all they've been through.
Okay, well, let's end this segment with a story that's a little more lighthearted. This one's about a Florida man who got arrested for stealing some really expensive Tiffany earrings.
Oh, yeah, I heard about this. Wait, wasn't there something strange about how he tried to hide the earrings?
You're not going to believe this. He swallowed them.
What? You're kidding, right?
I'm serious. The police have x-rays to prove it.
Wow, that is just crazy. Only in Florida, right?
Right. But apparently this guy has a history of stealing from Tiffany's. He's done it before in Texas, and he's got warrants out for his arrest in Colorado, too.
So this guy's got a real thing for Tiffany jewelry.
He definitely does. Maybe he should try getting a job there instead of stealing from them.
Yeah, that might be a better idea.
All right, well, let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with more news from around the world.
And from crazy Florida men and sparkly jewelry, let's shift our focus to a more serious matter. We're talking about Sudan, where a crowded market in a camp for displaced people was just hit by shelling. It's a really awful situation.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, the attack seems to have been carried out by the Rapid Support Forces, and it happened during the busiest time of day, which tragically also happened to be during Ramadan.
It's just a terrible tragedy, and it really highlights how dire the humanitarian situation is in Sudan right now. You've got millions of people who've been displaced from their homes, and there's a real risk of famine. And then you have this ongoing conflict between the army and the Rapid Support Forces, and that just makes everything so much worse.
Yeah, it's a really complex and volatile situation. And speaking of conflict and unrest, let's move on to Serbia, where the opposition is facing a lot of criticism after a protest in parliament got out of hand.
They ended up using smoke bombs and flares, which obviously disrupted the whole session, and 3 MPs were even injured.
Yeah, it sounds pretty chaotic. I mean, I can understand their frustration with the ruling SNS party. They've been in power for a long time, and there's a feeling that they're not being held accountable.
Right, and then you have events like the Novi Sad railway station disaster, which really raised concerns about corruption and a lack of transparency in the government.
So people are really starting to demand change. There were even calls for a technical government to be put in place until the next election to make sure things are fair.
Yeah, this whole incident really shows how much power the public has when they come together and demand accountability from their leaders.
All right, well, let's lighten things up a bit with an update on that Florida man who swallowed the Tiffany earrings.
Oh, yeah, that guy. So what happened? Did they ever get the earrings back?
Well, the police released some more details about the case. Turns out he pretended to be someone who worked for a professional athlete to get access to the really expensive stuff.
Wow, so this guy was pretty slick.
Yeah, and it looks like he's done this kind of thing before. He's suspected of stealing from a Tiffany store in Texas, and he's got multiple warrants out for his arrest in Colorado.
This guy really loves Tiffany's, huh?
He's got expensive taste, that's for sure.
Okay, so from Florida man shenanigans to a small but mighty nation, let's talk about Lesotho. It's a country completely surrounded by South Africa. It's actually often called the kingdom in the sky.
Yeah, Lesotho doesn't always get a lot of attention on the world stage.
Yeah.
But it was recently thrust into the spotlight when President Trump said that it was a country nobody has ever heard of.
Oh, wow. I bet the Lesotho government was thrilled about that.
Yeah, they weren't too happy about it. They issued a statement basically saying, hey, we're here and we matter too.
Right, because every country deserves recognition, no matter how small they are.
Exactly. And Lesotho's actually got some really interesting features. Like it's got these incredible mountains, which is where it gets the nickname Kingdom in the Sky.
Yeah.
And it's also a major exporter of water to South Africa.
So it plays a vital role in the region, even if it doesn't always get the recognition it deserves.
Right. It's a good reminder that every country has its own unique story to tell. All right, well, let's move on to a major development in the Middle East. The U.S. and Israel just rejected an Arab proposal for how to handle the reconstruction of Gaza after the war.
Yeah, this is a pretty significant move. So this plan was endorsed by a bunch of Arab leaders at a summit in Cairo, and it basically said that the 2.1 million Palestinians living in Gaza should be allowed to stay there.
Which is a pretty big contrast to President Trump's idea of relocating the entire population.
Right. And this Arab proposal also suggested that Gaza should be governed by a committee of independent experts for a while, and that international peacekeepers should be brought in to keep the peace.
So it's a pretty comprehensive plan. And it's actually got support from both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas.
Yeah, but the White House and the Israeli Foreign Ministry both said no to the proposal. They said it doesn't address the root causes of the conflict and that it lets Hamas off the hook too easily.
They're still pushing for Trump's vision of rebuilding Gaza without any involvement from Hamas, which has raised a lot of concerns about potential displacement of Palestinians and, the historical implications of that kind of thing.
Right. It's a very sensitive issue. And this disagreement just makes the whole situation in Gaza even more complicated. The ceasefire is already on shaky ground, aid deliveries are still blocked, and negotiations are going nowhere.
So the international community is really worried about what's going to happen next. They're urging everyone to try and find a peaceful solution that prevents more suffering and bloodshed.
Yeah, the stakes are really high right now. Hopefully they can find a way to de-escalate the situation before things spiral out of control.
Yeah, let's hope so. All right, well, that was a pretty intense roundup of global events. We covered a lot of ground today, from rising tensions in Europe and the Middle East to economic battles between superpowers and the human cost of conflict in places like Sudan and Gaza.
It's definitely a lot to take in, but it's important to stay informed about what's happening in the world.
Absolutely. It's a complex and constantly changing world out there, and understanding these events can help us make sense of it all.
And hopefully it inspires us to take action and make a difference in whatever way we can.
Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy stuff today. Let's try to end on a lighter note. We've got an update on that story about the Florida man who stole those Tiffany earrings and then,
Oh, yeah, the one who swallowed them, right? What happened with that?
Yeah, so it turns out this guy was pretty smooth about it. The police say he pretended to be working for some pro athlete so he could get access to the really high-end jewelry.
So he was like name dropping to get his hands on the good stuff?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this wasn't his first rodeo, apparently. He's also suspected of stealing from another Tiffany's in Texas, and there are warrants out for his arrest in Colorado, too.
Wow, this guy's got a serious thing for Tiffany's.
He really does. Maybe he should just apply for a job there.
Right. Might be easier than all the sneaking around.
All right, well, speaking of expensive tastes, let's circle back to that story about the U.S. and Israel rejecting the Arab proposal for rebuilding Gaza.
Right. So just to recap, that proposal basically said that Palestinians should be allowed to stay in Gaza and they would rebuild under the guidance of these independent experts and international peacekeepers.
And it actually had support from both the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it really is. But the U.S. and Israel are sticking to their guns. They still say that any rebuilding effort has to exclude Hamas completely.
Yeah, and that's really the crux of the issue, isn't it? It's such a complicated situation with so much history and so many strong feelings on all sides.
Absolutely. And with the ceasefire barely holding and those aid deliveries still blocked, things could really go either way.
It's a tense situation for sure. The international community is really pushing for everyone to come back to the negotiating table and try to find a peaceful solution.
Yeah, a solution that addresses the needs of everyone involved. That's the key.
Well, that about wraps up today's Daily News Roundup. We covered a lot of ground today, from those escalating tensions in Europe to the economic battles between the U.S. and China. And of course, we can't forget about the ongoing conflicts and the human cost in places like Sudan and Gaza.
It's a lot to keep track of, but it's important to stay informed about what's happening in the world around us. Even the stories that seem a little out there, like our friend in Florida with his taste for Tiffany's.
Exactly. Every story, no matter how big or small, helps us understand the bigger picture a little bit better. So keep those critical thinking caps on, everyone, and keep learning and keep engaging with the world around you.
That's what it's all about. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time for another roundup of news from around the globe.